The morning sun cast its golden rays through the stained glass windows of Liora's chambers, painting rainbow fractals across the marble floor as she stood before her ornate mirror, watching her lady-in-waiting fasten the intricate silver clasps of her ceremonial gown. Today marked the official announcement of her engagement to Crown Prince Aldric, a union that had been arranged since her birth 18 years ago, designed to strengthen the alliance between the kingdom of Ethermore and the neighboring realm of Dracmore. The emerald silk dress hugged her slender frame perfectly, its flowing skirts adorned with pearls that caught the light like captured stars, while her auburn hair was woven with threads of gold and secured with her mother's sapphire pret tiara. "You look radiant, my lady," whispered Mira, her devoted companion since childhood, as she adjusted the delicate chain around Liora's neck that held the royal engagement pendant, a magnificent ruby surrounded by diamonds that symbolized the cracked union of two powerful bloodlines. The weight of the jewel felt heavier than its actual mass, pressing against her chest like a constant reminder of the destiny that awaited her. One she had accepted with grace despite the absence of love in her heart for the man she was meant to marry. Liora's reflection revealed a young woman of ethereal beauty, with eyes the color of storm clouds and skin like porcelain touched by moonlight. Her full lips curved in what she hoped appeared to be a serene smile rather than the mask of resignation she truly wore. The engagement to Prince Aldric represented everything her kingdom needed: political stability, economic prosperity, and military protection. Yet as she gazed at her own image, she could not shake the feeling that she was looking at a stranger, someone playing a role in a grand performance rather than living her own authentic life. The sound of trumpets echoing from the courtyard below announced the arrival of the Dracmore delegation, led by Prince Aldric himself, whose reputation as a skilled warrior and competent ruler preceded him, though their few interactions had been formal and devoid of any spark of genuine connection. Liora took a steadying breath, reminding herself that duty to her people outweighed personal desires, a lesson her mother Queen Isabel had instilled in her from the earliest age, teaching her that royal blood carried with it the sacred responsibility to sacrifice individual happiness for the greater good of the realm. As the procession began, Liora walked through the castle corridors lined with nobles and courtiers, their faces beaming with approval and anticipation, while tapestries depicting the glorious history of Ethermore seemed to watch her passage with ancient eyes that had witnessed countless royal ceremonies throughout the centuries. The great hall beckoned ahead, its vaulted ceilings supported by columns carved with dragons and phoenixes, mythical creatures that symbolized the eternal cycle of destruction and rebirth. Though Liora had always found the dragon motifs particularly captivating, their fierce beauty speaking to something wild and untamed within her soul. Prince Aldric stood waiting at the altar, resplendent in his royal blue doublet embroidered with silver threads, his golden hair perfectly coiffed and his steel-gray eyes fixed upon her with what she interpreted as satisfaction rather than affection, his handsome features arranged in a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was undeniably attractive, with broad shoulders and a commanding presence that made him the ideal future king. Yet when their hands touched during the ceremonial blessing, Liora felt nothing more than the coolness of his skin and the firmness of his grip, devoid of any warmth or electric connection she had read about in the romantic ballads sung by traveling minstrels. The high priest's voice resonated throughout the hall as he recited the ancient words of betrothal, binding their souls in the eyes of the gods and their kingdoms in the realm of mortals, while incense burned in golden braziers, filling the air with the scent of frankincense and myrrh that was meant to purify their union and ensure divine favor for their future reign. Liora repeated her vows with a clear voice that betrayed none of her inner turmoil, promising to honor, cherish, and support Prince Aldric as his wife and future queen. Words that felt like chains wrapping around her heart even as she spoke them with perfect composure. The celebration that followed was a magnificent affair, with tables laden with delicacies from across both kingdoms, musicians playing enchanting melodies that made couples dance with joy, and wine flowing like rivers of liquid rubies that loosened tongues and brightened spirits. Yet Liora found herself feeling increasingly disconnected from the festivities, as if she were watching the scene unfold from behind a sheet of glass that separated her from genuine participation in her own engagement celebration. As the evening wore on and the guests grew more boisterous, Liora excused herself from the high table, claiming she needed fresh air to combat a sudden headache. Though in truth, she sought escape from the suffocating weight of expectations and the constant stream of congratulations from well-meaning nobles who spoke of her great fortune in securing such an advantageous match. The castle gardens offered sanctuary beneath the star-filled sky, where moonlight silvered the rose bushes and fountains sang their eternal songs, providing the solitude she desperately craved to process the momentous changes that had just been set in motion. The ancient oak tree at the garden's heart had been her childhood refuge, its massive trunk scarred by countless seasons, and its branches reaching toward the heavens like supplicating arms. And it was here that Liora found herself drawn as she had so many times before, when the burden of royal expectations became too heavy to bear. She settled herself among the gnarled roots, her silk gown spreading around her like a pool of liquid emerald, while she gazed up through the canopy at the constellation of Draco that dominated the northern sky, its serpentine form seeming to writhe among the stars as clouds drifted across the celestial canvas. A sound unlike any she had ever heard shattered the peaceful silence of the night, a deep, resonant call that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth itself, rising to harmonize with the wind and creating a haunting melody that made her blood sing in response, as if something ancient within her recognized and answered to that primal voice. The ground beneath her trembled with a subtle vibration that grew stronger with each passing moment, while the air itself seemed to thicken with an electric charge that made her skin tingle and her hair stand on end, as if a great storm were approaching, though the sky remained clear and filled with stars. From the direction of the whispering mountains, a shadow detached itself from the jagged peaks, growing larger as it approached with impossible speed, its form gradually resolving into something that defied belief even as her eyes confirmed what her rational mind struggled to accept. The creature that descended from the heavens was a dragon of magnificent proportions, its scales gleaming like polished obsidian in the moonlight, its wings spanning what seemed like half the kingdom, as they caught the night air with powerful strokes that created gusts of wind strong enough to bend the ancient oak's mighty branches. Liora should have run, should have screamed for the guards, should have done anything except remain frozen in place as the great beast settled onto the grass before her with surprising grace for something so massive, its golden eyes fixing upon her with an intelligence that was undeniably conscious and aware, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he were reading the very depths of her soul. The dragon's presence radiated power beyond mortal comprehension, yet she felt no fear, only a strange sense of recognition that defied all logic and reason, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this exact moment without knowing it. When the dragon spoke, his voice resonated not through the air, but directly within her mind, the ancient language he used somehow comprehensible to her, despite never having heard it before. The words carrying meanings that bypassed her intellect and spoke directly to her heart with truths that seemed to have been written in her very bones. "At last I have found you, my destined one," the dragon said, his mental voice rich with emotion that spanned centuries of searching and longing. "The stars foretold your birth, and the prophecies sang of this moment when our souls would recognize each other across the barriers that separate our kinds." The revelation struck Liora like a physical blow, her carefully ordered world crumbling around her as the implications of his words sank into her consciousness, threatening to overwhelm the rational foundations upon which she had built her understanding of reality and her place within it. "You must be mistaken," she whispered aloud, her voice barely audible even to herself. "I am engaged to be married, destined to be queen of 2 kingdoms, bound by duty and honor to fulfill the obligations of my birth." The dragon's great head lowered until his massive golden eye was level with her face, close enough that she could see her own reflection in its depths, distorted but somehow more honest than any mirror had ever shown her, revealing aspects of herself she had never acknowledged or understood. "Destiny cannot be denied, little flame," he said with infinite gentleness, the endearment sending unexpected warmth through her veins. "What mortals call duty is but a shadow cast by fear, while what we share transcends the petty concerns of kingdoms and crowns." Reaching back to the very dawn of creation when dragons and their chosen mates were bound by forces older than the gods themselves. As if to prove his words, the dragon began to shimmer and blur, his massive form condensing and reshaping itself through magic so ancient and powerful that the very air sparkled with residual energy, transforming before her amazed eyes into the shape of a man whose beauty was so devastating that it stole the breath from her lungs and made her heart stutter in her chest. He stood before her now in human form, tall and lean with silver-white hair that caught the moonlight like spun starlight, his skin bearing the faintest trace of scales that created intricate patterns across his exposed chest and arms, while his eyes remained the same molten gold that had gazed at her with such intensity moments before. "My name is Draconis," he said, his human voice carrying the same resonant quality as his mental communication, rich and melodious with undertones that spoke of vast age and accumulated wisdom. "I am the last of the Ancient Ones, guardian of secrets that predate your civilization by millennia, and I have spent 300 years searching for the one whose soul calls to mine across the void that separates our worlds." Liora found herself rising to her feet without conscious decision, drawn by an invisible force that seemed to emanate from every fiber of his being, her hand reaching out almost of its own accord to touch his chest where his heart beat with a rhythm that somehow matched her own, confirming what her rational mind still fought to deny. The moment their skin made contact, a jolt of pure energy coursed through both of them, illuminating the garden with brief golden fire that revealed the truth her soul had recognized from the first moment their eyes had met. "This cannot be happening," she breathed, even as her body betrayed her words by pressing closer to his warmth, her engagement ring suddenly feeling like a band of ice around her finger, rather than the symbol of honor and duty it had represented mere hours before. "I have responsibilities, obligations that cannot be abandoned for—" She struggled to find words for what was happening between them, this connection that defied everything she had been taught about love and marriage, and the proper order of royal relationships. Draconis raised his hand to cup her face with surprising tenderness, his touch sending cascades of sensation through her nervous system that awakened parts of herself she had never known existed, while his golden eyes searched hers with an expression of wonder mixed with ancient sadness. "You speak of obligations as if they were sacred vows," he said softly. "But tell me, dear one, when you promised yourself to this prince, did your heart sing with joy? Did your soul recognize its other half? Did the very fabric of reality shift to accommodate the rightness of your union?" The question pierced through her defenses with uncomfortable accuracy, forcing her to confront the hollow emptiness that had settled in her chest during the engagement ceremony. The sense of playing a role, rather than living her authentic truth, that had driven her to seek solitude in the garden. "Love is a luxury that royalty cannot afford," she replied, repeating the words her mother had spoken countless times, though they tasted bitter on her tongue when faced with the evidence of what true connection could feel like. "Duty and honor must guide our choices, not fleeting emotions or impossible dreams." "What we share is neither fleeting nor impossible," Draconis countered, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone with reverent care. "It is the fulfillment of a destiny written in the stars before your kingdom was ever founded, before humans learned to speak the names of their gods, before the first castle stone was laid upon another." His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, supported by knowledge that spans centuries of existence and observation of the intricate patterns that governed fate and choice. The sound of approaching footsteps and calling voices shattered the intimate bubble that had formed around them, reminding Liora with jarring suddenness that she was missing from her own engagement celebration, that guards and courtiers would soon discover her absence and come searching through the castle grounds. "You must go," she whispered urgently, torn between the desire to protect him from discovery and the desperate wish that this magical interlude could continue forever. "If they find you here, they will assume the worst, and war could break out between the kingdoms over mere suspicion of impropriety." Instead of retreating, Draconis stepped closer, his presence enveloping her like a protective shield that made the approaching voices seem distant and unimportant. His golden eyes blazing with intensity that spoke of decisions being made and lines being drawn that could not be uncrossed. "I will not abandon you now that I have found you," he declared with quiet finality, "but neither will I force you to choose before you understand the full truth of what stands before you." With fluid grace, he pressed something small and warm into her palm, closing her fingers around it before she could see what it was. "This will allow you to call me when you have need," he explained, his human form already beginning to shimmer with the approaching transformation back to his dragon shape. "And call me you will, dear one, for destiny cannot be denied indefinitely, no matter how many crowns and kingdoms stand in its path." The change swept over him like liquid starlight, expanding and reshaping until the magnificent dragon stood before her once more, his great wings catching the night air as he prepared to take flight. Before departing, he lowered his great head one final time, his mental voice filling her consciousness with words that would echo in her dreams for countless nights to come. "Remember this moment, little flame, when the weight of duty feels too heavy to bear and the coldness of obligation threatens to freeze the fire in your heart. What we have is real. More real than any ceremony or contract devised by mortal minds, and it will wait for you however long it takes for courage to overcome fear." With a powerful surge of his wings, Draconis launched himself into the star-filled sky, his form rapidly diminishing until he was nothing more than a shadow among shadows, leaving Liora alone in the garden with only the lingering scent of lightning and ancient magic to prove that their encounter had been anything more than an elaborate dream. She opened her palm to discover a scale of pure gold, warm to the touch and pulsing gently with inner light, undeniable proof that the impossible had indeed occurred, and that her carefully ordered world would never be the same again. The voices of the search party grew closer, forcing her to compose herself and prepare explanations for her absence. Though no words could adequately describe the transformation that had taken place within her during those precious moments of connection with her destined mate. As she smoothed her rumpled gown and attempted to restore order to her disheveled hair, Liora struggled to reconcile the dutiful princess who had participated in the engagement ceremony with the woman who had just experienced the awakening of her true self in the arms of an ancient dragon. Prince Aldric himself appeared at the head of the search party, his expression mixing concern with displeasure as he approached through the moonlit garden paths, his royal bearing and handsome features seeming somehow diminished after her encounter with Draconis, like a pale reflection of true masculine power and magnetism. "There you are," he said with obvious relief, though his tone carried an undertone of reproach that suggested her disappearance had caused him political embarrassment rather than personal worry. "The entire court has been searching for you, fearing some mishap had befallen our future queen. I apologize for causing concern," Liora replied with practiced grace, slipping the golden scale into a hidden pocket of her gown before offering her hand to her betrothed. "The excitement of the evening overwhelmed me, and I sought the peace of the gardens to clear my head." The lie came easily, trained into her by years of diplomatic necessity, yet it felt like betrayal of the profound truth she had just experienced, reducing the most significant moment of her life to a trivial excuse for social impropriety. As Prince Aldric escorted her back toward the castle, his hand at her elbow possessive yet impersonal, Liora found herself studying his profile with new eyes, searching for any spark of the connection she had felt with Draconis, and finding only the comfortable compatibility of well-matched political allies. His conversation focused on the successful negotiations completed during her absence, the trade agreements that would benefit both kingdoms, and the timeline for their wedding ceremony. All practical matters that demonstrated his competence as a future king while revealing nothing of his inner thoughts or feelings about their personal relationship. The great hall still blazed with celebration when they returned, though the absence of the guest of honor had cast a temporary shadow over the festivities that lifted immediately upon her reappearance. Courtiers and nobles rushing forward with renewed congratulations and elaborate toasts to the happy couple's future prosperity. Liora smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals, playing her role with the skill of long practice, yet every word of praise for her fortunate match felt like another layer of gauze wrapping around her authentic self, muffling the voice that wanted to cry out about the incredible truth she had discovered in the moonlit garden. Queen Isabel approached with the measured grace that had made her one of the most respected rulers in the known world, her keen eyes immediately detecting something different in her daughter's demeanor despite Liora's attempts to appear unchanged by her experience. "You seem unsettled, my dear," the queen observed quietly, drawing Liora aside from the crowd of well-wishers. I trust your brief absence was merely the result of pre-wedding nerves rather than any serious doubts about the wisdom of this union? The question struck closer to the heart of the matter than Liora had expected, forcing her to confront the growing chasm between her public duty and private desires that Draconis' appearance had torn wide open, threatening to swallow everything she had believed about herself and her destined path. "Of course not, Mother," she replied with what she hoped was convincing firmness. "Prince Aldric is everything our kingdom could hope for in an ally, and I am honored to play my part in securing our people's future, prosperity, and security." Yet even as she spoke the expected words, Liora's hand unconsciously moved to touch the hidden scale, its warmth seeming to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, a tangible reminder that duty and honor were not the only forces shaping human destiny, that somewhere in the vast tapestry of existence were threads of connection that transcended political necessity and social expectation. The weight of that golden token felt heavier than all the crown jewels combined, carrying as it did the promise of a different life, a different choice, a different understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. The celebration continued late into the night, with dancing and music and elaborate theatrical performances that told the story of legendary lovers whose devotion had overcome impossible obstacles, tales that now seemed to mock Liora's situation rather than entertain her as they once had. When Prince Aldric led her onto the dance floor for the traditional betrothal waltz, his practiced steps and formal demeanor provided a stark contrast to the wild freedom she had glimpsed in Draconis' embrace. The difference between a well-rehearsed performance and spontaneous expression of genuine feeling. As the weeks following the engagement passed in a blur of wedding preparations and diplomatic meetings, Liora found herself increasingly torn between the expectations of her position and the growing certainty that she was living someone else's life rather than her own. The golden scale remained her constant secret companion, hidden in various places throughout her chambers, its warmth providing comfort during the endless fittings for wedding gowns, meetings with foreign dignitaries, and strategy sessions about the combined kingdom they would rule after the ceremony that loomed ever closer on the horizon. Sleep brought little respite, for her dreams were filled with images of soaring through star-filled skies on mighty wings, of conversations conducted in the ancient language that somehow made perfect sense within the realm of sleep, of golden eyes that saw straight through to her soul without judgment or expectation. Only acceptance and recognition of who she truly was beneath the layers of royal training and social conditioning. She would wake from these visions with tears on her cheeks and an ache in her chest that no amount of duty or honor could ease. Prince Aldric proved to be an attentive fiancé in all the ways that mattered to the court and the kingdoms they represented, bringing her gifts of rare jewels and exotic flowers, consulting her opinions on matters of state, and treating her with the respectful courtesy due to his future queen. Yet their interactions remained cordial rather than, quote, passionate, intellectual rather than emotional, politically savvy rather than personally meaningful. During their private moments together, which were carefully chaperoned and formally structured, she found herself studying his face for any sign of the deep connection she craved, discovering only the satisfied expression of a man who had successfully negotiated a favorable contract. The realization that she was viewing their relationship as a business arrangement rather than a romantic union troubled her more with each passing day, especially when contrasted with the overwhelming sense of rightness she had experienced during those precious moments with Draconis in the moonlit garden. She began to understand that what the poets called love was not merely the stuff of songs and stories, but a real force that could transform understanding of oneself and one's place in the cosmic order. A force conspicuously absent from her engagement despite all its political advantages and social approval. 3 weeks after the engagement ceremony, as autumn painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her constantly of dragon scales and molten eyes, Liora received word that a delegation from the remote province of Shadowmere had requested an audience to discuss increased attacks by wild creatures that threatened their harvests and trade routes. The request seemed routine enough, the sort of provincial matter that required royal attention but posed no obvious complications, yet something about the timing and phrasing of their petition made her pulse quicken with inexplicable anticipation. The Shadowmere delegates arrived on a gray morning when fog shrouded the castle battlements, and made the ancient stones seem to fade in and out of reality like something from a half-remembered dream. Their travel-stained cloaks and weather-beaten faces speaking of urgent haste rather than leisurely diplomatic travel. Their leader, a grizzled old man named Garrett who served as the province's reeve, approached the throne with obvious reluctance, his eyes darting nervously around the great hall, as if he feared being overheard by unseen watchers lurking in the shadows between the tapestries. "Your Majesty, Your Highness," Garrett began with a deep bow that spoke of genuine respect rather than mere protocol. "We come bearing disturbing news from the borderlands, where the very fabric of reality seems to be unraveling under forces beyond our understanding or ability to combat." His words carried the weight of genuine fear, the kind of bone-deep terror that no amount of royal reassurance could easily dispel, suggesting that whatever threatened his people was far beyond the scope of ordinary bandits or wild animals. Queen Isabel leaned forward on her throne, her political instincts immediately alerting her to the potential implications of supernatural threats that could destabilize the carefully maintained balance of power between the various provinces and their neighbors. "Speak plainly, good Garrett," she commanded with the authority of decades spent managing crises both mundane and extraordinary. "What exactly has been happening in your lands that requires royal intervention rather than the attention of local magistrates and militia?" The old Ree's weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached into his travel pack, withdrawing what appeared to be a fragment of black stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light from the hall's numerous torches, braziers, creating an unsettling visual effect that made several courtiers step back instinctively. "We found this after the first attack," Garrett explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Embedded in the wall of our grain storehouse after something with claws the size of sword blades tore through solid oak as if it were parchment." Liora's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the unmistakable characteristics of dragon scale. Though this fragment was unlike anything she had ever seen in the ancient texts that filled the castle's library, its surface rough and corrupted where Draconis' scale was smooth and luminous, its energy cold and malevolent rather than warm and protective. The implications struck her like a physical blow as she realized that other dragons still existed in the world, creatures whose intentions might be far less benevolent than those of her destined mate. "There have been 3 attacks in the past fortnight," Garrett continued, his narrative growing more disturbing with each detail. "Each one more destructive than the last, as if whatever stalks our lands grows bolder and more aggressive with each successful raid. Livestock slaughtered and left to rot, buildings reduced to rubble without apparent purpose, and most terrifying of all, people who simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the scent of sulfur and the echo of inhuman laughter." Whoa. Prince Aldric stepped forward with the decisive bearing that had made him a respected military commander, his strategic mind immediately focusing on the practical aspects of the threat rather than its supernatural prey. Implications. Viewing the situation as a problem to be solved through conventional means rather than a mystery that might require unconventional approaches. "Have you attempted to track these creatures to their lair?" he inquired, his tone suggesting that proper military tactics should be sufficient to handle any threat, regardless of its otherworldly nature. "We tried, Your Highness," Garrett replied with obvious frustration, "but the tracks lead into the Whispering Mountains and then simply disappear, as if whatever made them took to the air or passed through solid rock like smoke, through a keyhole." His description of the vanishing trail sent chills through Liora's spine as she remembered her own encounter with a creature capable of both flight and seemingly impossible transformations. The mention of the Whispering Mountains crystallized her growing suspicions into near certainty, for those jagged peaks were precisely where Draconis had appeared from during their moonlit encounter, suggesting that the ancient dragon's presence in the region might have awakened or attracted other members of his long-dormant species. The realization that her destined mate might be connected, however inadvertently, to the threat facing her people created a complex web of conflicting loyalties that threatened to tear her apart from within. Queen Isabel's expression grew grave as she absorbed the implications of Garrett's report, her decades of experience in statecraft immediately recognizing the potential for panic and political instability if word of supernatural threats spread beyond the immediate circle of those present in the throne room. "This matter requires careful investigation before we take any precipitous action," she declared with the measured wisdom that had guided the kingdom through numerous crises. "We cannot afford to spread fear among our people based on incomplete information or unverified claims." "With respect, Your Majesty," Garrett interjected desperately. "Every day we delay costs more lives and livelihoods, and whatever hunts in the mountains grows stronger and more confident with each successful attack." His plea carried the weight of genuine anguish for his people's suffering, cutting through the political caution that typically governed royal decision-making and demanding immediate action regardless of potential consequences. The debate that followed revealed the fundamental tension between royal responsibility and political pragmatism, with various courtiers and advisors offering contradictory counsel based on their individual areas of expertise and personal agendas. Yet none of their suggestions addressed the underlying supernatural nature of the threat, or acknowledged the possibility that conventional military solutions might prove inadequate against creatures of legend and myth. As the discussion grew more heated and less productive, Liora found her attention drawn repeatedly to the corrupted dragon scale that Garrett had presented as evidence, its malevolent energy seeming to pulse in rhythm with some distant heartbeat that spoke of ancient hatred and consuming hunger for destruction. The contrast between this fragment and the warm golden scale hidden in her chambers could not have been more stark, suggesting that dragonkind was no more uniform in nature and intention than humanity itself. When the formal audience concluded with a decision to send a small investigative force to Shadowmere while maintaining strict secrecy about the supernatural aspects of the threat, Liora retreated to her private chambers with her mind churning through possibilities and implications that her royal training had never prepared her to consider. The comfortable certainties of her life, duty, honor, predetermined destiny had already been shaken by her encounter with Draconis. And now the revelation that other dragons might pose genuine threats to her people added layers of complexity that defied easy resolution. Alone in her rooms as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Liora withdrew the warm dragon scale from its hiding place and held it carefully in her palm, feeling its gentle pulse of energy that seemed to offer comfort and guidance in her moment of confusion and doubt. The contrast between its benevolent warmth and the cold malevolence of the corrupted scale from Shadowmere suggested that whatever was happening in the borderlands, Draconis himself was not responsible for the attacks. Destruction. The realization that she needed to contact him, to warn him of the situation and perhaps seek his guidance in understanding the nature of the threat, warred with her sense of duty to Prince Aldric and the kingdoms that depended on their union for political stability and military alliance. Yet the lives of innocent people hung in the balance, and if Draconis possessed knowledge that could help protect them, didn't her responsibility as future queen outweigh personal considerations and social expectations? The decision, when it finally crystallized in her mind, felt both inevitable and terrifying, representing a choice between the safe path of conventional duty and the uncertain territory of trusting in connections that transcended human understanding and social approval. With trembling fingers, she pressed the golden scale against her heart and whispered his name into the gathering darkness, not knowing whether the ancient magic would answer her call or if she was simply engaging in wishful thinking based on desperate hope. The response came not as words or visions, but as a sudden knowing that filled her consciousness with absolute certainty that he had heard her call and was already responding, crossing the vast distances that separated them with the incredible speed that only his dragon form could achieve. The knowledge that he was coming brought equal measures of relief and apprehension, for she had no clear idea how to explain her summons without revealing the growing doubts about her engagement that his very existence had planted in her heart. Within the hour, a soft tapping at her chamber window announced his arrival, though when she drew back the heavy curtains, she found not the massive dragon form she had expected, but Draconis in his human shape, balanced with impossible grace on the narrow ledge outside her third-floor window, his golden eyes blazing with concern, and barely contained emotion that spoke of the urgency with which he had answered her call. "You summoned me, little flame," he said softly as she opened the casement to admit him, his presence immediately filling her chambers with the scent of lightning and ancient magic that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch in her throat. "And I felt the distress in your call across leagues of mountain and forest." His transformation from dragon to man within the confines of her private rooms felt both intimate and dangerous. a secret that could destroy her reputation and political future if discovered by the wrong people. The sight of him in her personal space, surrounded by the familiar furnishings and decorations that marked her identity as a princess of Ethermore, created a jarring contrast between her public role and the private desires that his presence awakened, forcing her to confront the growing chasm between duty and authentic feeling that threatened to tear her apart from within. "There have been attacks in Shadowmere," she began without preamble, knowing that time was precious and that discovery would bring catastrophic consequences. "Creatures with dragon characteristics, but nothing like what you showed me of your true nature." Draconis' expression darkened with what she recognized as both anger and ancient sorrow, his golden eyes taking on depths that spoke of knowledge accumulated across centuries of existence and observation of patterns that repeated throughout history with tragic regularity. "I feared this day would come," he said grimly, moving to her window to gaze out at the night sky, as if reading portents written in the arrangement of stars and clouds. "Though I had hoped that my presence would not be enough to wake those who should have remained sleeping until the end of days." His words carried implications that chilled her to the bone, suggesting that her destined mate's arrival in the region had somehow triggered the awakening of malevolent forces that posed threats far beyond anything her kingdom's military forces were equipped to handle. "You're saying that your coming here caused these attacks?" she asked, dreading the answer even as she needed to understand the full scope of what they were facing. "Not caused, precisely," Draconis corrected with the careful precision of someone who had learned the importance of exact language through bitter experience. "But my presence may have served as a catalyst for powers that have slumbered beneath the mountains since the Age of Fire ended 3 millennia ago." He turned from the window to face her directly, his expression grave with the weight of secrets that had shaped the hidden history of the world. "There are others of my kind who did not accept the great binding that ended the Dragon Wars," he explained, his voice carrying echoes of conflicts so ancient that human civilization had barely existed during their Kwakai occurrence. Creatures whose hunger for dominion and destruction was contained rather than eliminated, sealed away in places where even their dreams could not touch the waking world. The revelation that the attacks were connected to prehistoric conflicts between different factions of dragonkind added layers of complexity that made Liora's head spin with implications. "And now they're awakening," she said, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with horrifying clarity, "drawn by your presence like calls to like, regardless of your intentions or the differences in your nature." The realization that her destined mate's very existence might endanger everything she held dear created a conflict between love and duty that seemed impossible to resolve without sacrificing one or the other. Draconis moved closer, his presence both comforting and overwhelming as he reached out to touch her face with the same tender reverence she remembered from their first encounter, his golden eyes blazing with emotions too complex for human language to adequately express. "I would leave this realm forever rather than see harm come to you or your people through my presence," he said with quiet intensity. "But running will not solve the problem that has already been set in motion, and those who have awakened will not return to slumber simply because I am no longer here to remind them of what they have lost." The nobility of his offer to sacrifice his own happiness for her people's safety moved her deeply. Yet she recognized the futility of such a gesture when the threat had already been unleashed, and would require active intervention rather than passive avoidance to resolve. "What can be done?" she asked, drawing strength from his presence even as she grappled with the magnitude of the crisis that had suddenly engulfed her carefully ordered world. "The ancient seals can be renewed," Draconis replied, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge passed down through generations of his kind. "But it requires the willing participation of one who carries both dragon blood and human heritage, someone whose dual nature can bridge the gap between the mortal and immortal realms." His words hung in the air between them like a challenge and a promise, their implications both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Liora felt her breath catch as understanding dawned, the pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place with crystalline clarity that left no room for doubt or denial about what he was suggesting. "You're saying that we," she began, unable to complete the thought that would change everything she believed about herself and her place in the cosmic order of things. "The bond between us is more than mere attraction or destiny," he confirmed gently, his golden eyes never leaving her face as he spoke truths that would reshape her understanding of reality itself. It is the manifestation of an ancient magic that flows through both our bloodlines, creating possibilities that neither could achieve alone. The revelation that their connection served a purpose beyond personal fulfillment added weight to feelings she had been trying to dismiss as impossible infatuation. Before she could fully process the implications of his words, the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside her chambers sent both of them into immediate alert. The dangerous intimacy of their situation suddenly stark in the face of potential discovery that could destroy not only her reputation, but potentially trigger the very war their kingdom sought to avoid through her marriage to Prince Aldric. "Hide!" she whispered urgently, her mind racing through possibilities as she heard the distinctive cadence of royal guards approaching her door, their measured steps suggesting official business rather than routine patrol. "Behind the tapestry there, and whatever happens, don't reveal yourself unless I'm in mortal danger." Draconis melted into the shadows with the fluid grace that spoke of centuries spent avoiding detection, his human form somehow becoming nearly invisible among the rich fabrics and ornate furnishings that decorated her chambers. While Liora quickly smoothed her hair and arranged her expression into what she hoped was appropriate calm for receiving unexpected visitors at such an unusual hour. The knock, when it came, carried the formal rhythm that indicated the presence of high-ranking officials rather than servants or ladies-in-waiting. And when she opened the door, she found Prince Aldric himself standing in the corridor, flanked by two of his personal guards, and wearing an expression that mixed concern with something that might have been suspicion. "Forgive the intrusion at such a late hour," he said with the practiced courtesy that marked all their interactions, though his steel-gray eyes were already scanning her chambers with the thoroughness of someone trained in military observation. "But there had been reports of unusual activity in the castle grounds, and I wanted to ensure your safety before retiring for the evening." The explanation sounded plausible enough, yet something in his manner suggested deeper currents of suspicion or knowledge that made Liora's pulse quicken with apprehension even as she maintained her composed exterior. "How thoughtful of you," she replied smoothly, stepping aside to allow him entry while praying that Draconis remained perfectly concealed. "Though I assure you I've seen nothing unusual from my windows tonight." Prince Aldric entered her chambers with the confident bearing of someone who had every right to be there, his gaze cataloging details with the systematic approach of a military commander assessing potential threats or gathering intelligence about enemy positions. The guards reported seeing a large shadow passing overhead. He continued conversationally, though his tone carried undertones that suggested the information was more significant than casual observation. Something too large to be any known burn and moving with purpose rather than random flight patterns. The description struck uncomfortably close to the truth of Draconis' arrival, forcing Liora to call upon all her diplomatic training to maintain an expression of mild interest rather than the panic that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "How strange," she said with what she hoped was appropriate curiosity. Perhaps it was merely clouds obscuring the moon, creating shadows that appeared more substantial than they actually were. Perhaps. Prince Aldric agreed, though his continued examination of her chambers suggested he remained unconvinced by her explanation, his attention lingering on details that seemed perfectly normal to her but might reveal evidence of recent occupancy to AIs trained in detection and investigation. "You seem somewhat unsettled this evening," he observed, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that often preceded more direct questioning. The comment forced her to confront the possibility that her emotional turmoil was more visible than she had realized, that the profound impact of her encounters with Draconis had left traces that could be detected by someone who knew her well enough to recognize changes in her typical demeanor and behavior patterns. "The reports from Shadowmere have been troubling," she replied truthfully, seizing upon a legitimate source of concern that could explain any unusual aspects of her manner. "The thought of our people facing unknown threats is naturally disturbing to anyone with responsibility for their welfare." Prince Aldric's expression softened slightly at her response, the political calculation in his eyes giving way to something that might have been genuine approval of her concern for their future subjects, though even his moments of apparent warmth felt measured and strategic rather than spontaneous expressions of authentic emotion. Your compassion for the common people is one of your most admirable qualities, he said with what sounded like sincere appreciation, and it will serve you well when we rule together as king and queen. The casual reference to their shared future sent an unexpected pang through her chest. A sharp reminder of the life that had been planned for her before Draconis' arrival had opened her eyes to possibilities she had never imagined. Choices that her royal training had never prepared her to consider or evaluate against the weight of duty and obligation. I should allow you to rest, Prince Aldric continued after a moment's pause, during which his gaze had once again swept the room with subtle thoroughness. Tomorrow will bring new challenges in our preparations for dealing with the Shadowmere situation, and we'll need clear heads to navigate the political complexities that such matters invariably create. His departure came as a relief so profound that Liora had to lean against the closed door for several moments before trusting her legs to support her weight. The tension of maintaining perfect composure while her destined mate remained hidden mere feet away, having drained her reserves of strength and emotional control more than she had realized during the encounter itself. He suspects something, Draconis said quietly as he emerged from concealment, his golden eyes reflecting concern not for his own safety, but for the potential consequences that discovery might bring to her reputation and political position. Though whether his suspicions are based on observed evidence or intuitive recognition of change in your demeanor, I cannot determine. The possibility that Prince Aldric might possess enough genuine feeling for her to detect alterations in her emotional state brought a complexity to their situation that Liora had not previously considered, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable reality that her betrayal of their engagement might cause him actual pain rather than merely political inconvenience. We cannot continue meeting like this, she said with reluctant acknowledgement of the impossible position they were creating for themselves. The risks are too great, not just for us but for both our kingdoms and all the people who depend on the stability that our marriage is meant to provide. Yet even as she spoke the words of reason and responsibility, her heart rebelled against the prospect of severing the connection that had brought meaning and authenticity to her existence for the first time in her life. Then we must find another way, Draconis replied with quiet determination, his presence filling her chambers with an energy that made conventional solutions seem pale and inadequate by comparison. For the threat that has awakened will not wait for human politics to resolve themselves, and every day of delay costs innocent lives while the ancient evils grow stronger and more confident in their destructive power. The reminder of the supernatural crisis that had prompted her summons refocused her attention on the larger implications of their situation, forcing her to recognize that personal desires and political obligations might both be secondary to the immediate necessity of protecting her people from forces beyond conventional understanding or military capability. Tell me what must be done, she said with the decisive tone that had been trained into her from childhood, the voice of a future queen accepting responsibility for difficult decisions regardless of personal cost. And I will find a way to accomplish it, whatever the consequences might be for my own future or happiness. Draconis moved closer, his presence both comforting and overwhelming as he reached for her hands. His touch sending cascades of warmth through her nervous system that awakened every fiber of her being to possibilities that transcended the narrow confines of royal duty and political necessity. The ritual requires 3 elements, he began, his voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge passed down through generations of his kind. A place of power where the barriers between worlds grow thin, an artifact of binding that can contain and redirect supernatural forces, and the willing sacrifice of something precious to demonstrate the sincerity of our commitment to the greater good. Each element he described carried implications that sent chills through her spine, suggesting that the path to resolving the crisis would demand more than she had ever imagined possible, requiring choices that would fundamentally alter not only her own fate, but potentially the entire balance of power between the supernatural and mortal realms. The place of power lies within the Whispering Mountains themselves, he continued, his golden eyes reflecting depths of knowledge accumulated across centuries of existence. In caverns that predate human civilization, and still echo with the magic of the First Age when dragons and mortals shared the world as equals rather than enemies. The description painted images in her mind of vast underground spaces filled with crystalline formations that pulsed with their own inner light, chambers where reality itself might be malleable enough to accommodate the impossible. The artifact of binding, he paused, his expression growing troubled as he contemplated the second requirement, must be forged from the willing sacrifice of a dragon's heart scale, the single scale that grows directly over our most vital organ and contains the essence of our immortal life force. The revelation that he would need to literally give up a piece of his eternal existence to power the ritual added a dimension of personal sacrifice that made her own potential losses seem trivial by comparison. And the precious thing that must be willingly sacrificed? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer with the certainty that comes from deep understanding of cosmic balance and the prices that must be paid for intervention in the natural order of things. Your crown, he said simply, the two words carrying implications that reverberated through every aspect of her identity and understanding of her place in the world. Not merely the physical object, but everything it represents: her royal authority, your predetermined destiny, your carefully arranged future as queen of two united kingdoms. The magnitude of what he was asking struck her like a physical blow, demanding nothing less than the complete abandonment of everything she had been raised to believe about her purpose and responsibility. The silence that followed his explanation stretched between them like a chasm that neither could easily cross. Filled with the weight of impossible choices, and the recognition that any decision they made would irrevocably alter not only their own lives, the fate of countless innocent people, whose safety and prosperity depended on the stability that her marriage to Prince Aldric was meant to provide. If I refuse, she said quietly, needing to understand the full scope of the choice before her, what happens to the people of Shadowmere, and how long before the ancient evil spread beyond the mountains to threaten the heart of both our kingdoms? The question carried its own answer in the grim set of his features, and the ancient sadness that filled his golden eyes. Without intervention, the awakened ones will grow stronger with each passing day, he replied with the weight of prophecy and bitter experience, feeding on the fear and destruction they sow until they possess enough power to break free from the mountains entirely and spread their influence across the known world like a plague of supernatural malevolence. The image he painted was one of civilization crumbling before forces beyond human understanding or resistance, armies and castle walls proving as ineffective as parchment barriers against creatures of legend and nightmare. And if I agree to the ritual, she continued, pressing him for the complete truth regardless of how painful it might be to hear, what guarantee is there that our sacrifice will be sufficient to contain threats that have slumbered for millennia? And what assurance can you give that we won't simply be trading one catastrophe for another equally devastating outcome? His honesty, when it came, was both brutal and beautiful in its absolute sincerity, revealing the profound depth of his commitment to truth regardless of its impact on his own desires or chances of securing her cooperation. There are no guarantees in magic of this magnitude, he admitted with the humility of someone who had learned the limits of even supernatural power through hard experience. Only the certainty that doing nothing will result in suffering and destruction on a scale that will make the current attacks seem like minor inconveniences by comparison. The weighted decision settled on her shoulders like a mantle made of lead, each consideration and implication adding to the burden until she felt as if she might collapse under the sheer magnitude of what was being asked of her. Yet alongside the crushing pressure came a clarity of purpose that had been absent from her life since childhood. A sense that for the first time she was being called upon to make a choice that truly mattered, rather than simply fulfilling predetermined expectations. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging within her heart and mind. "Before the situation in Shadowmere deteriorates beyond any hope of containment or resolution?" The practical question helped ground her in immediate realities rather than becoming lost in the overwhelming implications of supernatural conflicts and cosmic responsibilities. "Days, perhaps a week at most," Draconis replied grimly, his expression reflecting the urgency that had driven him to answer her summons with such desperate speed. "The barriers that have contained them for so long are weakening with each successful attack, and once they achieve full manifestation in the physical realm, no power short of divine intervention will be sufficient to force them back into dormancy." The timeline he described left precious little opportunity for the careful consideration and gradual adjustment that such momentous decisions typically required, forcing her to confront the reality that some choices must be made based on instinct and faith, rather than comprehensive analysis of all possible outcomes and their implications for every affected party. "I need time to think," she said finally, the words feeling inadequate to express the complexity of her situation yet representing the only honest response she could offer in the face of such overwhelming circumstances. "Time to understand what I would truly be sacrificing and whether I have the right to make such decisions without consulting those who would be most affected by their consequences." Draconis nodded with understanding that spoke of wisdom accumulated across centuries of existence and observation of the patterns that govern mortal behavior in times of crisis and impossible choice. "I will wait for your decision," he said with patience that somehow conveyed urgency without pressure. "But remember that each day of delay costs innocent lives while the ancient evils grow stronger and more confident in their power to reshape the world according to their malevolent desires." His departure through her window carried the same fluid grace that had marked his arrival, his human form dissolving into shadow and starlight before reforming into the magnificent dragon that caught the night air with powerful wing strokes that carried him swiftly away from the castle and back toward the mountains, where ancient secrets waited to be either renewed or unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. Alone in her chambers with only the lingering scent of lightning and magic to prove their encounter had been real rather than elaborate fantasy, Liora found herself pacing the ornate carpets like a caged creature, her mind churning through possibilities and implications that her royal education had never prepared her to evaluate or understand with anything approaching adequate comprehension. The golden scale in her palm pulsed gently with warmth that seemed to offer comfort and guidance, yet its very presence served as a constant reminder of the impossible choice that lay before her. The decision that would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the survival of everything she held dear in the world. Sleep, when it finally came in the hours before dawn, brought dreams filled with images of vast caverns, where crystalline formations sang with voices older than human memory, of ritual fires that burned with colors that had no names in mortal languages, and of choices whose consequences rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, creating patterns of cause and effect that stretched far beyond the ability of any single mind to comprehend or predict. She woke to the sound of urgent knocking at her chamber door, her lady-in-waiting's voice carrying a note of barely controlled panic that immediately banished the last vestiges of sleep and filled her with dread about what news the morning might have brought from the troubled borderlands of her Kirkwood realm. "My lady," Mira called through the heavy oak, "Queen Isabel requests your immediate presence in the war room, and Prince Aldric has been summoned as well. There's been another attack in Shadowmere, far worse than any that came before. And the survivors are speaking of things that cannot be real, yet their wounds and terror suggest otherwise." The summons struck her like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about the deteriorating situation, while simultaneously providing the external pressure that might force her hand regarding the impossible decision that had consumed her thoughts throughout the sleepless night. As she dressed hurriedly in appropriate court attire, her fingers trembled with the weight of knowledge that she alone possessed. Understanding that sat like a stone in her chest, as she prepared to face questions she could not answer without revealing secrets that could destroy everything. The war room buzzed with activity when she arrived. Maps of the borderlands spread across the great table while advisors and military commanders argued over troop deployments and defensive tact. Strategies that she knew would prove utterly inadequate against the supernatural forces that were gathering strength with each passing hour. Prince Aldric stood at the head of the table, his bearing radiating the confidence of the seasoned military leader who believed that any problem could be solved through proper application of force and tactical superiority. Queen Isabel's expression, however, reflected the deeper understanding that comes from decades of experience with crises that defy conventional solutions, her keen eyes immediately detecting something different in her daughter's demeanor that suggested knowledge or involvement beyond what the official reports contained. "The situation has escalated beyond anything we initially anticipated," the Queen began without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that would affect thousands of lives. "And we require a comprehensive response that addresses not only the immediate threat but the underlying causes that have created such unprecedented devastation." The newest survivor to reach the capital told a story that chilled the blood of everyone present, describing creatures that moved like liquid shadow but struck with the force of avalanches, beings whose very presence corrupted the natural world around them, turning fertile soil to ash, and clear streams to pools of something that burned like acid, yet flowed like water. His account of the destruction wrought in a single night painted a picture of malevolent intelligence behind the attacks, suggesting that whatever stopped the borderlands was not merely destructive, but actively malicious in its targeting of human settlements and infrastructure. The conventional military approach is clearly insufficient, Prince Aldric admitted with reluctant honesty, his strategic mind forced to acknowledge the limitations of even the most advanced weapons and tactics when faced with enemies that operated according to rules he did not understand. We need additional resources, perhaps consultation with scholars who specialize in unusual phenomena. The admission that supernatural solutions might be required opened a door that Liora had been waiting for, providing an opportunity to introduce concepts and possibilities that might otherwise have been dismissed as fantasy or hysteria by minds trained in purely rational approaches to problem-solving and crisis management. Perhaps, she said carefully, measuring each word for its potential impact and implications, we should consider that some threats require unconventional responses, solutions that draw upon knowledge and resources beyond those typically available to military and political leaders. Her suggestion carried just enough ambiguity to avoid direct admission of supernatural involvement, while opening the possibility for alternative approaches to be discussed and evaluated. The debate that followed revealed the fundamental challenge of bridging the gap between rational skepticism and desperate need for effective action, with various factions arguing for approaches that ranged from massive military intervention to seeking aid from neighboring kingdoms whose own resources might prove equally inadequate against forces beyond conventional understanding. As the discussion grew more heated and less productive, Liora found herself studying the faces around the table, recognizing that these good people were trying their best to address a crisis using tools and knowledge that were fundamentally inadequate to the task, like attempting to fight a hurricane with sword and shield, or negotiating with an earthquake through diplomatic protocols. The realization that she possessed the key to ending the crisis, along with the terrible knowledge of what that key would cost her personally, created a weight in her chest that made breathing difficult and speaking almost impossible. Yet with each passing moment, the moral imperative to act grew stronger than her personal fears and desires. "I may know of a solution," she said quietly, her words falling into a momentary lull in the argument like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of attention that focused every eye in the room upon her with expressions ranging from hope to skepticism to desperate relief that someone might possess answers that had eluded their collective wisdom. The silence that followed her statement stretched taut with expectation and unspoken questions, forcing her to confront the moment of truth that would either save her people or destroy everything she had ever believed about herself and her place in the cosmic order of existence. "The solution," she continued with growing steadiness as purpose overcame fear, "will require resources and approaches that lie outside conventional understanding, and it may demand sacrifices that go beyond anything we have previously considered acceptable in the name of protecting our people from supernatural threats." Queen Isabel leaned forward with the intense focus that had made her one of the most effective rulers in the known world, her political instincts immediately recognizing that her daughter possessed knowledge crucial to resolving the crisis well, simultaneously sensing the deeper currents of conflict and difficult choice that surrounded whatever solution was being proposed. "Speak plainly, child," the Queen commanded with the authority of absolute power tempered by maternal concern. "What do you know that we do not? And what resources do you believe might prove effective where conventional approaches have failed so completely?" The moment of decision had arrived with crystalline clarity that left no room for doubt or further delay, forcing Liora to choose between the safe path of continued secrecy and the dangerous honesty that might save thousands of lives while potentially destroying her own carefully constructed future and identity. "I know someone," she said, with quiet conviction. "Someone whose knowledge of these matters extends back to the very origins of the threats we face, and who possesses the power to renew the ancient barriers that once contained such forces beyond the reach of mortal harm." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness, yet also brought a sense of relief that came from finally speaking truth after days of deception and internal conflict. Prince Aldric's expression sharpened with sudden suspicion. his military training immediately alerting him to the implications of supernatural knowledge and resources that had been concealed from official awareness, while his personal investment in their engagement added layers of jealousy and territorial concern that made his questions more pointed than they might otherwise have been. "And who is this mysterious individual who claims knowledge of matters that predate recorded history?" he asked with barely controlled skepticism. "What proof do you have of their abilities? And why have you not mentioned this resource before now when lives were at stake and conventional solutions were proving inadequate?" The challenge in his voice carried undertones that suggested personal betrayal alongside professional frustration, forcing her to confront the reality that her concealment of the truth had already damaged trust between them in ways that might prove impossible to repair, regardless of how the current crisis was ultimately resolved. "Because," she replied with steadily growing confidence, "the knowledge comes with costs that I was not certain our kingdom was prepared to pay. And the individual in question requires guarantees of safety and acceptance that might prove difficult to provide given the general skepticism regarding supernatural matters that pervades our court, military leadership." Her explanation danced around the edges of complete honesty while avoiding the direct admissions that would immediately complicate an already impossible situation, buying time to gauge reactions and prepare for the more detailed revelations that would inevitably follow if they chose to pursue the path she was cautiously suggesting. Queen Isabel's expression revealed the complex calculations of a ruler weighing potential solutions against their probable costs, her decades of experience with difficult decisions providing insight into the deeper implications of supernatural aid that might come with prices beyond conventional understanding or acceptance. "The cost," the Queen said with quiet intensity. "What exactly would this mysterious ally require in exchange for assistance that could save our people from destruction and our kingdom from collapse into chaos and anarchy?" The question carried the weight of someone prepared to make difficult sacrifices if they proved necessary for the greater good. It also reflected the caution of a ruler who understood that some prices might be too high to pay regardless of their immediate benefits. The moment had come for complete honesty, the point where half-truths and careful omissions would no longer suffice to address the magnitude of the crisis or the scope of the solutions required to resolve it effectively, permanently. "Everything," Liora said simply, the single word carrying implications that reverberated through every aspect of her identity and future. "My crown, my title, my arranged marriage, my predetermined destiny as queen of two united kingdoms, in short. The willing sacrifice of everything I was born to be in exchange for the power to become something else. Entirely." The admission fell into stunned silence that seemed to stretch for eternity, each person in the room processing the implications of her words according to their own understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the prices that might reasonably be demanded for salvation from supernatural threats that defied all conventional solutions and approaches. Prince Aldric's face went through a series of expressions that ranged from shock to hurt to anger, his carefully controlled composure cracking under the weight of revelations that struck at the heart of their relationship and the political alliance that their marriage was meant to cement between their respective kingdoms. "You would abandon everything," he said with quiet intensity that was somehow more devastating than shouting would have been. "Our engagement, our kingdom's alliance, our people's hopes for unity and prosperity, all for the sake of chasing after some phantom solution offered by someone whose very existence you cannot prove, and whose, quote, motives remain completely unknown?" The pain in his voice surprised her with its genuine quality, revealing that beneath the political calculation and strategic thinking lay authentic feelings that her choices would wound in ways that went beyond mere diplomatic inconvenience or personal embarrassment, adding another layer of guilt to the already overwhelming burden of decision that pressed down upon her shoulders. "I would sacrifice everything," she corrected gently but firmly, "to save everyone, including you and our kingdoms, and all the innocent people whose lives hang in the balance while we debate the acceptable costs of salvation versus the comfortable certainties of predetermined failure." Her words carried the weight of absolute conviction born from direct experience with both the threat they faced and the solution that could address it. Yet she recognized that such certainty might appear as madness or delusion to those who lacked her supernatural encounters and understanding of the forces at work beneath the surface of conventional reality. The debate that erupted following her declaration revealed the fundamental tensions between individual sacrifice and collective responsibility, between traditional approaches to crisis management and radical solutions that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality and the proper limits of royal authority and personal choice. As voices rose in argument and counter-argument, Liora found herself thinking not of the political implications or personal costs, but of the terrified survivors from Shadowmere whose wounds and trauma testified to the reality of threats that conventional wisdom dismissed as impossible, of the innocent lives that would be lost with each day of delay, and of the ancient evil that grew stronger with every successful attack, while they debated the acceptable prices of effective response. The decision, when it crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity, felt both inevitable and liberating, representing the first truly authentic choice she had ever made in a life governed by duty and expectation. The first time she had chosen her own path, rather than following the predetermined trajectory that others had laid out for her benefit and their own. "I have made my choice," she said with quiet finality that cut through the argumentative chaos like a blade through silk, her voice carrying an authority that had never been present during her years of dutiful compliance with royal expectations and social conventions. "And I will do whatever is necessary to protect our people, regardless of the personal cost or political consequences that may result from actions taken in desperation and hope rather than calculation and compromise." The silence that followed her declaration was profound and complete, filled with the recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power and decision-making that would affect not only the immediate crisis, but the long-term future of relationships and alliances that had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, until the moment when destiny intervened to offer different possibilities and demand impossible choices. Queen Isabel was the first to break the heavy stillness, her voice carrying the measured weight of someone who had spent decades making decisions that balanced personal desires against the needs of thousands, understanding better than anyone in the room the true magnitude of what her daughter was proposing to sacrifice for the greater good. "You speak of abandoning your crown as if it were merely a piece of jewelry," she said with complex emotion that mixed maternal concern with royal authority. "But you were born to rule, trained from childhood to carry the responsibilities that come with power, shaped by every lesson and experience to fulfill a destiny that extends far beyond your personal preferences, individual happiness." The Queen's words carried echoes of countless conversations they had shared over the years, moments when duty had been explained and reinforced as the highest virtue a royal could possess, the sacred obligation that justified the privileges and luxuries that surrounded their lives like protective barriers against the harsh realities faced by common people. Yet beneath the familiar rhetoric, Liora detected something new in her mother's tone. A recognition that circumstances had moved beyond the comfortable certainties of traditional royal responsibility into territory where established rules might prove inadequate to address unprecedented challenges. "I was born to serve our people," Liora replied with growing confidence, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to emanate from some deep source within her that had never been fully awakened until this moment of ultimate choice. "And if that service requires me to abandon the throne in order to save the kingdom, then that is the sacrifice that honor and duty demand. Regardless of how it might appear to those who measure worth by titles and crowns rather than by the protection of innocent lives." Her words reframed the entire discussion, transforming what had appeared to be abandonment of duty into its ultimate expression, a redefinition of royal responsibility that prioritized results over tradition, substance over form, authentic service over ceremonial compliance with predetermined expectations and social conventions that might have lost their relevance in the face of supernatural threats that defied conventional understanding. Prince Aldric stepped forward, his expression cycling through emotions too complex for easy interpretation, hurt and anger warring with what might have been grudging respect for the courage required to make such an impossible choice, in full knowledge of its personal and political consequences. "And one of the alliance between our kingdoms?" he asked with carefully controlled intensity. "What happens to the peace and prosperity that thousands of people depend upon when the marriage that was meant to cement that alliance is dissolved in favor of chasing after mystical solutions that may prove to be nothing more than elaborate fantasy or dangerous delusion?" His question struck at the heart of the political complexities that surrounded their situation, forcing everyone present to confront the reality that individual choices, however nobly motivated, carry consequences that rippled outward to affect countless lives and the stability of institutions that had taken generations to build and maintain through careful negotiation and mutual compromise. "Perhaps," Liora said with inspiration born from desperation, "there are other ways to maintain the alliance between our kingdoms. Partnerships based on mutual aid and shared challenges rather than dynastic marriage that was arranged without consideration for the personal feelings or authentic connections of those involved." Her suggestion opened possibilities that none of them had previously considered, alternatives to traditional diplomatic solutions that might prove more flexible and ultimately more durable than marriages of convenience between reluctant partners. The debate that followed explored options and implications that ranged from formal treaties and trade agreements to shared military commands and joint responses to threats that neither kingdom could handle alone, revealing the extent to which their arranged marriage had been seen as the only viable solution to problems that might admit of multiple approaches and creative alternatives that better served the needs of all parties involved. As the discussion progressed, Liora found herself thinking not only of the political and diplomatic considerations, but of the supernatural crisis that continued to unfold in Quaid, the borderlands, while they debated human solutions to problems that might require intervention beyond the scope of mortal power and understanding. Forces that grew stronger with each passing hour of delay and indecision. "Time is running out," she said with quiet urgency that cut through the complex negotiations and theoretical discussions. "While we debate the political implications of various courses of action, people are dying and ancient evils are gaining strength that may soon prove impossible to contain through any means available to human wisdom and power." Her reminder of the immediate crisis refocused attention on practical necessities rather than abstract possibilities, forcing everyone to confront the reality that perfect solutions might not be available and that imperfect action might prove superior to continued deliberation. Queen Isabel's expression grew grave as she absorbed the implications of her daughter's warning, her decades of experience with crisis management providing insight into the dangers of paralysis through analysis, the tendency for complex problems to grow worse while leaders sought comprehensive solutions that addressed every concern and satisfied every stakeholder perfectly. "Very well," the Queen said with the decisive authority that had guided the kingdom through numerous challenges over the years. "If you truly believe that this mysterious ally can provide solutions that our conventional resources cannot match, then you have my permission to make contact and explore what terms might be acceptable to all parties involved." The authorization carried weight beyond mere parental approval, representing official royal sanction for pursuing supernatural aid despite the skepticism and concerns that surrounded such unconventional approaches to crisis resolution. Prince Aldric's face reflected the complex emotions of someone forced to watch his carefully planned future dissolve before his eyes. Yet his response revealed the nobility of character that had made him a respected leader despite their lack of romantic connection. "If this is truly the only way to save innocent lives," he said with quiet dignity, "then I will not stand in your path, though I reserve the right to judge these mysterious allies by their actions rather than their promises." His words carried the weight of someone choosing duty over personal desire, accepting painful sacrifice for the greater good in a manner that mirrored her own difficult decision. The formal dissolution of their engagement took place with surprising speed and efficiency, royal scribes preparing documents that released both parties from their obligations, while establishing frameworks for continued alliance between their kingdoms based on mutual aid and shared defense against common threats rather than dynastic union that had lost its relevance in the face of circumstances that neither side had anticipated or prepared for during their original negotiations. As the paperwork was completed and official seals were applied to documents that would reshape the political landscape of both realms, Liora felt a profound sense of freedom mixed with terrifying uncertainty about what lay ahead, the weight of predetermined destiny lifting from her shoulders only to be replaced by the heavier burden of choices that would be entirely her own responsibility and consequence. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold that reminded her constantly of dragon scales and molten eyes, she stood once again in her chambers preparing for what might be the last night she would spend as Princess Liora of Ethermore, her royal identity about to be transformed into something entirely new and unknown. The golden scale in her palm pulsed with gentle warmth as she pressed it against her heart and whispered his name into the gathering darkness, her voice carrying a note of finality and determination that had been absent from their previous communication, reflecting the profound transformation that had taken place within her during the hours of impossible qadr, decisions and irreversible choices. The response came more swiftly than before, as if Draconis had been waiting for her call with the patient intensity of someone who understood the magnitude of what she had been asked to consider and the courage required. To abandon everything familiar in favor of unknown possibilities and supernatural responsibilities that defied conventional understanding of royal duty and personal sacrifice. When he appeared at her window, his human form seeming to materialize from starlight and shadow with the fluid grace that never failed to take her breath away, his golden eyes immediately detected the change in her demeanor, recognizing the resolution that had replaced uncertainty and the quiet strength that had emerged from accepting the unacceptable with dignity and purpose. "You have made your choice," he said with certainty rather than question, his voice carrying complex emotions that spoke of relief mixed with sorrow for what her decision would cost her. Understanding better than anyone the magnitude of what she was sacrificing for the sake of people who might never fully comprehend the true nature of the threat they faced, or the price that had been paid for their salvation. "I have," she replied with steady conviction, her words carrying the weight of irrevocable commitment made with full knowledge of its consequences. "My engagement to Prince Aldric has been formally dissolved, my claim to the throne renounced in favor of protecting our people from forces that conventional power cannot address or contain." The admission felt both liberating and terrifying, representing the first truly authentic choice she had ever made despite the overwhelming uncertainty about what lay ahead. Draconis moved closer, his presence filling her chambers with the scent of lightning and ancient magic that had become as familiar and comforting as her own heartbeat, his expression reflecting a depth of emotion that transcended simple gratitude or relief, touching something profound and eternal that connected their souls across the barriers that typically separated mortal and immortal beings. "The sacrifice you have made," he said with reverent understanding, "goes beyond what most mortals could comprehend or accept, requiring a courage that speaks to the true nobility of your spirit rather than the accident of your birth into royal circumstances." His words acknowledged not only her choice but the inner strength that had made such a choice possible, recognizing qualities that had been shaped by adversity and tested by impossible circumstances. "Now we must move quickly," he continued with urgency that reflected the deteriorating situation in the borderlands. "For each day of delay costs more innocent lives while the ancient evils grow stronger and more confident in their power to reshape the world according to their malevolent desires and twisted understanding of natural order." The reminder of external threats refocused their attention on practical necessities rather than personal implications, emphasizing that their connection, however profound, served purposes that extended far beyond individual happiness or romantic fulfillment. "What must I do?" she asked with the practical directness that had been trained into her through years of royal education and crisis management, her mind already shifting from emotional processing to strategic planning, accepting that effective action required clear thinking despite the overwhelming nature of the changes that had swept through her life in the space of mere hours. "First, we must reach the sanctum of binding deep within the Whispering Mountains," Draconis explained, his voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge passed down through generations of his kind. "A place of power where the barriers between worlds grow thin enough to accommodate the magic required for renewing seals that have contained ultimate evil for millennia." The description painted images in her mind of vast underground chambers carved from living rock, spaces where reality itself became malleable enough to accommodate forces beyond normal comprehension. "The journey itself will require you to leave behind not only your royal identity but your human limitations as well." He continued with careful explanation of transformations that would challenge every assumption she had held about the nature of existence and her own capabilities. "For the path to the sanctum cannot be traveled by ordinary mortals, requiring abilities that can only be awakened through the bond we share and the ancient magic that flows through both our bloodlines." The implications of his words sent chills through her spine, while simultaneously awakening something deep within her consciousness, a recognition of possibilities that had always existed but remained dormant, until circumstances arose that demanded their activation and expression through choices that transcended conventional understanding of human potential and limitation. "You're saying that I will be changed?" she asked, needing to understand the full scope of what acceptance would require, the extent to which her fundamental nature would be altered by participating in rituals and magic that operated according to laws older than civilization itself. "Enhanced," Draconis corrected gently, his golden eyes blazing with intensity that spoke of profound connection and shared destiny that went beyond surface attraction or temporary alliance. "Awaken to abilities that have always been part of your heritage but remained latent until the proper circumstances and willing choice created conditions for their emergence into conscious awareness and deliberate use." The revelation that she possessed supernatural heritage added another layer of complexity to her understanding of herself and her place in the cosmic order, suggesting that her attraction to the dragon motifs that decorated the castle and her immediate recognition of Draconis's true nature had been expressions of genetic memory and inherited connection rather than mere coincidence or romantic fantasy. "What kind of abilities?" she pressed, her practical mind demanding specific information about changes that would fundamentally alter her relationship with reality and her understanding of what was possible within the constraints of physical existence and natural law. "The power to fly without wings," he replied with patient explanation of gifts that defied conventional understanding. "To communicate across vast distances through thought alone, to see through deceptions and illusions that fool ordinary perception, and to channel the elemental forces of creation and destruction that flow through the deep structures of reality itself." Each ability he described represented a fundamental expansion of human potential, capabilities that would transform her from a mortal princess into something approaching a demigod in terms of power and perception. The magnitude of the transformation he was offering struck her like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that accepting his proposal would result in becoming something entirely different from what she had always believed herself to be, abandoning not only her royal identity but her basic humanity in favor of existence on a plane that transcended normal mortal experience and understanding. "And the cost of such power?" she asked, her royal training in negotiation and consequences making her wary of gifts that seemed too generous to be freely given, without hidden prices or unexpected obligations that might prove more burdensome than the original problems they were meant to solve. "The inability to return to your former life," Draconis answered with complete honesty that revealed both the wonder and the tragedy of the choice she faced. "Once awakened, these abilities cannot be sealed away again, and the perspective they provide will make it impossible to find satisfaction in a limited existence that once seemed complete and fulfilling." His words carried the weight of someone who understood the price of transcendence from personal experience, the isolation that came with perceiving reality in ways that ordinary mortals could never share or fully comprehend. The choice between remaining human with all its limitations and evolving into something greater with all its consequences presented itself with stark clarity that admitted no compromise or middle ground, forcing her to decide not only what she was willing to sacrifice, but what she was prepared to become in the service of protecting those she loved from threats they could never understand or fight alone. "Will I still be me?" she asked with vulnerability that revealed her deepest fear about the transformation, the concern that awakening supernatural abilities might erase the essential self that she had spent 18 years developing and understanding, leaving behind only power without personality or abilities without authentic identity. "You will be more yourself than you have ever been," Draconis assured her with conviction born from intimate knowledge of the transformation process and its effects on consciousness and identity. "Freed from the limitations and expectations that have constrained your authentic expression, able to act according to your true nature rather than the role that circumstances of birth forced upon you." His promise suggested that rather than losing herself, she would discover aspects of her identity that had been suppressed or denied by the demands of royal duty and social convention. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside her chambers provided an unwelcome reminder that time was precious, and that discovery of their meeting could still complicate an already impossible situation, forcing them to make decisions quickly, rather than taking the careful time for consideration that such momentous choices typically deserved. When? She asked with acceptance that surprised her with its completeness, the word emerging from some deep place within her that had already made the choice before her conscious mind had finished processing all the implications and consequences of what she was agreeing to undertake. Tonight, Draconis replied with urgency that reflected the deteriorating situation in the borderlands. While the castle sleeps and our departure can be accomplished without raising alarms or triggering searches that might interfere with the ritual that must be completed before the ancient evils achieve full manifestation in the physical realm, the timeline he proposed left no opportunity for second thoughts or gradual adjustment, demanding immediate commitment to a course of action that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of her existence. "I need to leave word," she said with practical consideration for those who would worry about her disappearance. "Something that will prevent unnecessary searches or panic while avoiding explanations that might reveal too much about the true nature of our mission." The balance between reassurance and secrecy required careful crafting of messages that would satisfy immediate concerns without providing double information that could be used against them by those who might not understand or approve of supernatural solutions to conventional problems. Working together, they composed a letter that spoke of urgent diplomatic mission requiring absolute secrecy, personal sacrifice made willingly for the greater good, and requests that no searches be undertaken that might compromise delicate negotiations with allies whose assistance was crucial to resolving the crisis in Shadowmere. The wording was deliberately vague yet reassuring, designed to buy time while avoiding specific claims that could be easily verified or contradicted by later events. As she sealed the letter with her personal signet ring, knowing that this might be the last time she would use the symbol of her royal authority, Liora felt the weight of 18 years of identity and expectation lifting from her shoulders, replaced by anticipation and terror in equal measure as she prepared to step into a future that held no guarantees except the certainty of fundamental change. The transformation of her clothing from elaborate court dress to simple traveling attire suitable for dangerous journeys through mountain wilderness happened with startling efficiency. Draconis providing garments that seemed to be woven from moonlight and shadow, offering protection against both physical hardship and magical detection by those who might seek to track their movements through conventional or supernatural means. "Are you ready?" he asked as they prepared to leave through her window, his golden eyes reflecting concern for her welfare mixed with admiration for the courage she had shown in making choices that most mortals would find impossible to contemplate, much less accept with such grace and determination despite the overwhelming uncertainty about what lay ahead. "No," she replied with honesty that acknowledged her fears while affirming her commitment, "but I am willing, and perhaps that is enough to begin a journey that will either save everything I love or destroy me in the attempt." Her words carried the weight of someone who had counted the cost and found it acceptable when measured against alternatives that offered no hope for protecting innocent lives from supernatural threats beyond conventional understanding or response. The transformation from human to dragon that swept over Draconis filled her chambers with golden light that seemed to emanate from within his very being. The change magnificent and terrible in its scope, as his form expanded and reshaped itself according to laws that defied every assumption about the fixed nature of physical reality and the limitations that governed mortal existence. When the great dragon lowered himself to allow her to climb onto his back, Liora felt a moment of vertigo that had nothing to do with height, and everything to do with the realization that she was about to leave behind not only her castle and kingdom, but her entire understanding of what was possible in a world that had suddenly revealed depths and complexities she had never imagined. The first powerful stroke of his wings carried them up and away from the only home she had ever known, the castle dwindling below them as they climbed toward the star-filled sky that had once seemed like a distant ceiling but now revealed itself as an ocean of infinite possibility stretching endlessly in all directions. Around them, the wind rushing past her face carried scents of mountain snow and ancient forests, of places where human feet had never walked, and secrets older than recorded history waited to be discovered by those brave enough to seek truth beyond the comfortable boundaries of conventional knowledge and accepted wisdom about the nature of reality itself. As they flew through the night toward the whispering mountains that loomed like jagged teeth against the star-filled sky, Liora felt something stirring within her consciousness. Awakening awareness that seemed to respond to the altitude and speed and vast perspectives that surrounded them with growing intensity. As if the dragon's flight was triggering changes that had been waiting dormant within her genetic heritage, for the proper catalyst to awaken them into active expression. The sensation of power flowing through her veins like liquid starlight made her gasp with surprise and wonder. Her mortal limitations beginning to dissolve, as supernatural abilities awakened in response to proximity with her destined mate and participation in bond. Magic that operated according to principles older than human civilization, and more fundamental than physical laws that governed ordinary existence. By the time they reached the entrance to the mountain caverns that would lead them to the sanctum of binding, Liora could feel that she was no longer entirely human, that the transformation Draconis had described was already beginning to reshape her on levels that went far deeper than mere physical appearance or conventional understanding of personal identity and capability. The cavern mouth yawned before them like the entrance to another world entirely, its depths shrouded in darkness that seemed to swallow light while simultaneously emanating a faint phosphorescent glow that Pribern spoke of crystalline formations and geological processes that had been influenced by supernatural forces for countless millennia. From this point forward, Draconis said as he resumed human form beside her at the threshold of the ancient passage, we enter realms where the normal rules of reality become merely suggestions, where thought and will can reshape the fabric of existence itself, and where the choices we make will echo through dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. His warning carried the weight of someone who had traveled such paths before and understood both their wonders and their dangers. The first steps into the cavern felt like crossing a bridge between worlds, the temperature and air pressure changing in ways that had nothing to do with altitude or geology, and everything to do with the thinning cold. Barriers between dimensions that allowed supernatural forces to operate with greater freedom and intensity than was possible in the mundane realm above. Crystalline formations began to appear along the cavern walls as they descended deeper into the mountain's heart, their surfaces pulsing with colors that had no names in human language, casting light that revealed details and textures that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation and the intent of the observer. The crystals respond to consciousness itself, Draconis explained as he noticed her fascination with the impossible geometries and living light that surrounded them. Growing and changing based on the thoughts and emotions of those who passed through these sacred spaces, recording the history of every soul who has sought to touch the fundamental forces that govern creation and destruction. The revelation that their very presence was altering the environment around them added another layer of responsibility to their mission, emphasizing that their choices and actions would leave permanent marks on places that had remained largely unchanged for geological ages. As they continued deeper into the mountain's heart, following passages that seemed to exist in more dimensions than conventional geometry allowed, Liora began to perceive details and connections that her ordinary human senses had never been capable of detecting, awareness expanding to encompass flows of energy and patterns of meaning that operated beneath the surface of physical reality. The awakening of supernatural perception brought with it an understanding of the true scope of the crisis they faced, revealing the network of corruption and malevolent influence that was spreading outward from the ancient evils that had been partially awakened by Draconis' presence in the region. Tendrils of darkness reaching toward population centers and strategic locations with purposeful intelligence that spoke of careful planning and strategic thinking. They know we're coming, she said with sudden certainty born from her expanding awareness, detecting attention and malevolent intent focused on their location with uncomfortable intensity. Whatever has awakened in these mountains is aware of our presence and purpose, and they're preparing countermeasures to prevent us from reaching the sanctum or completing the rituals successfully. Draconis nodded grimly, his own supernatural senses confirming her perception while adding details that painted an even more troubling picture of organized opposition and tactical preparation that suggested their enemies possessed intelligence and resources far beyond what the surface attacks had revealed. The corrupted ones were once dragons like myself, he explained with sorrow that carried the weight of ancient betrayals and lost kinship. But they chose to embrace the darkness that exists within all conscious beings, feeding on destruction and suffering until they became something fundamentally different from what they had been created to be. The revelation that their enemies were fallen members of his own species added personal dimensions to the conflict that went beyond abstract struggle between good and evil. They retain all the knowledge and power of dragonkind, he continued with warning that emphasized the magnitude of the threat they faced. But they have twisted those gifts toward purposes that would ultimately destroy everything they once protected, seeking not merely dominion but the complete unmaking of ordered reality itself. The scope of their enemies' ultimate goals revealed the true stakes of their mission, suggesting that failure would result in consequences that extended far beyond the immediate region to threaten the fundamental structure of existence itself. The passage ahead began to widen into a vast underground chamber, whose ceiling disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of even supernatural vision. Its floor covered with complex patterns carved into the living rock that seemed to shift and move in response to their presence. Ancient symbols that predated human writing and conveyed meanings that bypassed rational understanding to speak directly to the soul. The sanctum of binding, Draconis announced with reverence that reflected the sacred nature of the space they had entered. Where the original seals were forged through the willing sacrifice of beings whose power and wisdom surpassed anything that exists in the modern world. The history he described painted images of godlike entities who had given up their immortal existence to contain threats that might otherwise have ended all life and hope in the universe. At the chamber's center stood a circular platform carved from a single piece of crystal that seemed to contain its own internal source of illumination, emanating light that revealed every detail of their surroundings while simultaneously creating shadows that suggested depths and complexities beyond immediate perception. Patterns within patterns that spoke of mathematical principles governing reality at its most fundamental level. The ritual requires precise timing and absolute commitment, Draconis explained as they approached the ancient altar. For once begun, it cannot be stopped or modified without catastrophic consequences that would release the very forces we seek to contain. His warning emphasized the importance of complete understanding and unwavering determination, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation once the process commenced. "And if we succeed?" she asked, needing to understand not only the risks, but the potential rewards that might justify the enormous sacrifices they were preparing to make, for the sake of people who might never know the true nature of the threat they had faced, or the price that had been paid for their salvation. "The ancient evils will be sealed away for another age," he replied with hope tempered by realism about the cyclical nature of such conflicts. "The immediate threat to your people will be eliminated, and you will possess the power and knowledge necessary to guard against future incursions of darkness that might threaten the world." The promise of security and capability offered compensation for the losses they would endure, suggesting that their sacrifices would purchase not merely temporary relief, but lasting protection for generations yet unborn. The sound of approaching wings echoing through the vast chamber provided immediate confirmation that their enemies had indeed detected their presence and were moving to prevent completion of the ritual, forcing them to begin the process immediately rather than taking additional time for preparation and mental adjustment to the magnitude of what they were attempting. "They come," Draconis said with grim determination, his human form already beginning to shimmer with the approaching transformation back to his dragon shape. "And we must complete the binding before they can interfere with the delicate balance of forces required for success." The urgency in his voice reflected understanding that timing had become crucial, that windows of opportunity were measured in moments rather than hours. As the first of the corrupted ones appeared at the chamber's entrance, their forms twisted parodies of noble dragons corrupted by millennia of feeding on darkness and suffering. Liora felt the full awakening of her supernatural heritage surge through her consciousness like a dam bursting, flooding her awareness with power and knowledge that transformed her understanding of herself and her capabilities in ways that defied description or explanation. The final choice, when it came, required no thought or deliberation, emerging from the depths of her transformed consciousness with the inevitability of sunrise. The certainty that some things were worth any price, and that protecting innocent life justified sacrifices that might seem impossible from the limited perspective of ordinary mortal existence. Together, they began the ritual that would either save the world or destroy them in the attempt, their combined power creating currents of energy that made the very foundations of the mountain tremble, while reality itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of Enquacon. outcome that would echo through eternity regardless of whether they succeeded or failed in their desperate gamble with forces older than time and more powerful than death itself. The culmination of their journey had finally arrived, and with it the moment of truth that would determine whether love and sacrifice could triumph over ancient hatred and the seductive darkness that sought to unmake everything they held sacred in the universe.